Great to see you all here. Thank you for joining us. It's fabulous to have you here with us for this very exciting start to our lecture series.
Absolutely. Nice to see everyone.
Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to a very special new lecture series. Tuesday Travellers, or Traveller Tuesdays, presented by Australians studying abroad. This is going to be a series of free lectures throughout the year presented by expert ASA tour leaders. So you will be able to travel to all sorts of wonderful parts of the world virtually. And of course, you'll be able to think about where you would like to travel in reality. So I would like to begin this evening by welcoming Kristen Hellstrom, who is the director of ASA. Kristen is the heart of ASA. She has planned so many wonderful tours for me, for David, and for all of the other tour leaders. She is a real perfectionist when it comes to detail. She has an amazing knowledge of the world and different places to which ASA has conducted tours. So it is a real pleasure to welcome Kristen Hellstrom, director of ASA, to our lecture this evening.
Oh, thank you very much, Susannah. Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome you all, as Susannah said, to the lectures. It was something that ASA used to do for many, many years, and unfortunately with COVID, everything had all stopped, but I am so grateful to Susannah to assist ASA to relaunch the lecture series in our first series in the Zoom format. Also, I'd like to thank David for being so kind as to give the very first lecture for this series, but also just generally to thank all those travellers who've been so loyal and supportive of ASA. We had, as you can imagine, a few tough years in the past, but our ASA travellers were incredibly supportive. And I'm delighted to see that people are starting to return to travel, and just generally very grateful for your continued support. So I'm delighted to have you all join today, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristen. Well, it's now my very great pleasure to introduce a dear friend of mine and a truly fabulous ASA tour leader, David Henderson, who is an award-winning artist. He has held many solo exhibitions around the world and, of course, in Australia. And he has accompanied over 50 ASA tour groups. So he's been to France, to Italy, Australia, the UK, different places around Europe, and, of course, also the United States. David has many wonderful tours coming up for ASA. He will be with me on the literary tour of Scotland that takes place May to June this year, the Banks and Braes of Literary Scotland. So David will be telling everybody about Charles Rennie Mackintosh and various other artists that we encounter on the tour. This year and next year, he is leading a tour called Venice, Jewel of the Adriatic. And as David lives for half of every year in Venice, this is a city that he knows extremely well. And I think anyone going to Venice with David is very fortunate indeed. He's also going to be in 2024 in April, leading an artistic tour to Sicily and the Aeolian Islands. With me, once again, in June of next year, he'll be conducting a tour to literary northern France. And of course, so many of the great Impressionist painters were based in northern France. We'll be going to museums for Eugène Boudin and many other wonderful artists. So David will be doing all of the artistic side of that really fabulous tour. And then in October 2024, David and I will together be leading a literary and artistic tour of Sicily called A Dimension of the Imagination. And that's one that we are both very much looking forward to. So without further ado, let me pass on to you, David Henderson, award-winning artist, art historian, ASA tour leader, dear friend, and I'm very much looking forward to his introduction to the Art of Venice. Thank you, David. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Susannah. Great honour, great pleasure to be invited to present the inaugural of these lectures. I'm thrilled to be given the opportunity to share my great interest and my great love of one of the really significant schools of painting of of Western Europe, the Art of Venice. And so by way of introduction, I would like to just sort of say a few words about the conditions that created or that contributed to creating this extraordinary school of painting. And I'm taking the liberty to show you one of my own paintings, which is of Venice, and just by way of talking about the extraordinary characteristics of the city of Venice, which I'm sure you know, in its watery setting with its magnificent Gothic, Baroque, and Renaissance architecture, is one of the great wonders of Europe, of the world, indeed. And what I would like to ask you to think about is the city of Venice as a place which encourages a certain kind of habit of seeing, a kind of a certain suggests certain ways of understanding the world visually. So everyone knows there's a very famous light, a very famous quality of light in Venice, and this extraordinarily sort of luminous atmospherics of Venice have contributed very much to its character. It's architecturally of enormous significance. So it's a city of endless and innumerable exquisite surfaces over which the light plays. And of course, in its watery setting, it presents to the visitor or to the inhabitant an endless array of the dazzling effects of light and reflection on water. And if you think about it, a reflection is a sort of representation in itself. It's like a little painting of a building or an object in the canal below. So it's not only me, but many commentators have remarked on the extraordinarily visual character of the city of Venice itself. And I think this very much feeds into the whole kind of tradition of painting and the very aesthetic of the Venetian artists. The other thing I'd like to remind you of too is that Venice, in the words of Sister Wendy Beckett, she did this lovely TV segment. I don't know if you probably remember her, but she said Venice has something of the mystery of the Orient about it. And I don't know if we'd use such old-fashioned language these days to describe Venice, but we must remember that it's the very strong connections with the Silk Route. It's the western end of the Silk Route, and the very important relations it had with Constantinople and the whole culture of Byzantium. And Byzantine art, I think, in its purest form, is we see in the art of mosaic. And mosaic is, of course, a very important industry, a very important art form in Venice due to the glass industry that existed there since antiquity. And in wonderful images like this view of the dome of creation in the Basilica of St. Mark's reminds us that of the characteristics of the art of mosaic, the lustrous surface, the intricate design, the incredibly rich color. And above all, again, it's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of depicting things. For a Venetian, or for a Venetian artist, a picture is a series of little tiles or little patches of color laid together to create an image that is comprehensible in the mind. Very much like, I think, the very pixels that you are looking at this image on your screen. And that may seem sort of quite an obvious way of making a picture, but there are other traditions, other ways of thinking about representing things, as we'll see. And the art of Venice can be really, I think, reaches its most sort of concentrated and quintessential form in the wonderful Pala d'Oro, the golden altarpiece, which is on the high altar of St. Mark's Basilica. It's made of beaten gold and contains almost 1,000 precious and semi-precious stones and beautiful enamels. And so this opulent, luxurious and aesthetically thrilling, I think, art is very much at the sort of the core of Venetian sensibilities, the way Venetians think about things. That's a little close-up of that extraordinary thing, which is the Pala d'Oro. And it, I think, informs the art of the Middle Ages of Venice. So the altarpiece you're seeing here by Domenico Veneziano, quite similar to a lot of altarpieces which we find in central Italy around the middle of the 14th century. But here I think we can say it has a particularly Venetian character. with its extensive use of gold, its rich color, and in its elaborate design. It has very much this sort of Byzantine flavor, I think you can say. But I really want to talk about this altarpiece in the context of, I think, one of the most important stories that you can tell about the art of Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries, and that is the development of pictorial space, the development of what we call the sacra conversazione in altarpieces as well. It develops in tandem with that. And if we can compare the Veneziano painting on the left with the Mantegna painting on the right, we can see that in the painting on the left, we have this very sort of conventional arrangement of the Madonna enthroned in the center of the altarpiece, and she's flanked by a series of saints on either sides. And what we see in the left-hand image is each figure really sort of framed in its own little niche, as it were, by these Gothic arches, and each occupying his own little piece of space. And what we see is something very different on the right-hand side. So not only are we seeing that the figures are inhabiting a more unified space in the painting on the right, which is by Andrea Mantegna, but we see that the sort of very architectonic frame is helping to create that sort of space. And you really just need to look at the way in which the painted architecture in the altarpiece on the right continues that of the sculpted and gilded frame, so that we really get this great sense of a continuous, coherent, unified space beyond the sort of the frame, so looking through windows, as it were. The painter, as I said, Andrea Mantegna, very important painter of sort of the second half of the 15th century in Italy. Mantegna is from the city of Padua, which is near Venice. So not strictly speaking a Venetian, but the example of the altarpiece here, which you see, which he painted for the church of San Zeno in Verona, represents a very important stepping stone on this journey towards the conquest of pictorial space, we can say. And Mantegna's altarpiece was in turn influenced not by a painting, but by a sculpted group, which was made by Donatello, the famous Florentine sculptor. We don't really know how that group stood. The sculptures are still there, but on the left we have a reconstruction of it by an art historian named Pope Hennessy, who sort of is proposing an arrangement which is very similar, as you can see, to the Mantegna arrangement of figures. And so the Renaissance comes quite late to Venice. So we're really in the middle of the 15th century now, the mid-1400s, 1460 is the date of Mantegna's altarpiece. But it's been happening in Florence since really the beginning of the 15th century, so for the last 50 years or so. But the arrival of Donatello really brings the Renaissance, I think, to the Veneto, and it's taken up by people like Mantegna. Now, Mantegna, as you may know, goes on to become court artist for the Dukes of Mantua, but he marries very well from an artistic point of view. He marries into the leading artistic family in Venice. He marries the sister of Giovanni and Gentile Bellini. I'm sure you've all heard of the Bellini family. Gentile and Giovanni are brothers. Gentile is one of the leading painters for the city of Venice. He paints these grand scenes of processions and ceremonies, and he's actually more famous than Giovanni, but Giovanni is far more important for the history of art. And one of the reasons for that is that he really brings oil painting to Venice, and this is enormously important. Oil painting opens up a whole kind of repertoire of techniques which extend the possibilities of the easel painting, let's say, and make possible all sorts of extraordinary effects and techniques and detail. And there's a very, I think, charming story told by art historians of the Sicilian painter Antonello da Messina. Antonello da Messina is said to have adopted the oil technique when he was connected to the court of Naples, where there were Flemish painters working. It was the Van Eyck brothers traditionally. are said to have invented the technique of oil painting, but it was Antonello da Messina who's said to have brought it to Italy and to have combined a sort of an Italian sensibility, a classical sensibility, with the new oil painting technique. Now, oil painting is very important because it enables a number of technical possibilities. Because oil has a long drying time, it means that the artist can spend a bit of time really to work up detail. They can blend the colors together very softly. They've got all the time in the world to do that because, as I said, doesn't dry so quickly. And the paint, most importantly, I think, can be used in a number of ways. It can be used very thickly in what we call impasto. Oil paint can be used in a diluted way, mixed with turpentine, so it's a kind of wash. And I think most importantly, it can be used in transparent glazes. So it can be mixed with all sorts of media, with varnishes and other oils, to create these incredibly sort of rich, translucent layers of paint, which can be built up to create these extraordinarily subtle and atmospheric effects. So here we've got Giovanni Bellini in this 19th century representation of sort of anecdotal painting, telling this, as I said, rather charming story. According to the story, Giovanni Bellini hears about this new oil painting technique, and he believes that Antonello is jealously guarding the secret of it. So he poses as a wealthy Venetian merchant and pretends to be sitting for a portrait to Antonello. So here we see Antonello at the beginning of the portrait, and he's pouring a little bit of some unknown liquid onto his palette, and Giovanni Bellini on the left, you can see leaning forward, peering at it, perhaps sniffing at it to work out what it might be. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he adopts the oil painting technique, and really European painting is never the same, because he uses the oil painting technique not as the Flemish do to create extraordinary detail, but in a very new way to create these wonderfully harmonious and atmospheric effects. Giovanni Bellini lived for a long time. He lived until well into the 16th century, but he's coming out of a sort of a late Gothic tradition. So he really had plenty of time to develop this technique, this new technique, into an extraordinarily subtle and powerful medium for painting. So here we can see yet another step in the development of the sacra conversazione, a very coherent space, which is, as you can see, defined by the architecture very clearly. We've got this sort of apse-like or niche-like space behind the Madonna and the four saints. And the space is not only defined by perspective, as in the sort of the checkerboard on the pavement, the checkered pavement, and the very carefully drawn architecture, but it's also defined by light and atmosphere. And this is something very new that Bellini brings to the Sacra Conversazione in these years. And it's not only the unifying light which falls over the figure, it's this extraordinary harmony of color which Bellini has developed over the years through his understanding of oil painting. And the word sacra conversazione in Italian, I suppose, translated means a sacred or a holy conversation. So there's no real conversation going on, but it's really just a way of referring to this kind of atmosphere of rapt silence, of almost a silent communion between the figures, which, as you can imagine, is important because we're seeing the Virgin Mary, we're seeing St. Peter, St. Jerome, and two early Christian saints, all people who existed in different historical periods. So it's a way of unifying them, bringing them together and connecting them with the viewer. And I think this is one of the reasons why pictorial space was invented, was developed in the 15th century in these altarpieces. It was a way of bringing the viewer closer to the space which is inhabited by the saints. These are the people who are going to intercede on your behalf. According to the religious ideas of the time. This is, I think, a much nicer image. I don't know if you can see on your screen. You really get a lovely sense of these wonderfully sonorous colours, the harmony, which is very nicely underscored by the music-making angel sitting on the base of the Virgin Mary's throne. It's sort of a painting about wisdom, isn't it? The little carved head above the Madonna indicates that it's the throne of Solomon. and we have the two sort of scholarly men with their books and the two virtuous ladies, all again standing together in this silent communion. And so Bellini's able to create these incredibly powerful moods in his painting. This is a view of the altarpiece in the Church of San Zaccaria in Venice, and I'm sure you can notice the extraordinary integration of the carved stone frame with the actual painted architecture. And if you look at it, the pilasters on the left-hand side, the one on the far left and the far right is a stone pilaster, but then if you look in the painting, that they are sort of replicated, and the architecture is continued on. So you get this sort of doubly convincing sense of the space of the painting being continuous with your own as a viewer. And I think this is a sort of a theme in Venetian painting, the way that the architecture connects with the painting. And as I said, Venice is a supremely architectural city. I mean, that's all it is, really. It's just buildings and water. It's a very elemental sort of a place. So Giovanni Bellini's has a couple of pupils, and they develop this technique very strongly from him. The other thing too that I want to mention that Giovanni Bellini is developing is landscape. And it's not just landscape to make a nice backdrop to the painting. It's landscape which helps to magnify the mood and even the meaning of the painting. So here we've got the famous Madonna of the Meadow in the National Gallery in London. Like the previous painting, the date is around about 1505. And we see a sort of a foretaste of the death of Christ, so that the Christ child lies in the Virgin Mary's lap in something that is a sort of a, as I said, reminds us of his death and sacrifice, and the Virgin Mary has a very sort of melancholy expression on her face because she knows of the terrible fate that awaits her son. And this is underscored by the rather sinister-looking raven in the tree beyond. But the wonderful spring landscape gives us a sense of new hope, rebirth, resurrection, all of these positive things. And I think really creates a sort of a resonance and a meaning in the painting that it would not otherwise have. And once again, it's just this wonderfully subtle use of oil paint, which has enabled an extraordinary feeling for harmony, for atmosphere, for luminosity, which draws the whole painting together in an extraordinary unity. And what a wonderful painter is Bellini. Look at that village in the background. That could be something out of a Cubist painting. It's an extraordinary sort of integration of all the abstract forms within his picture, which I think we can all appreciate today. So Bellini's pupils are Titian and Giorgione. This is a very famous painting by Giorgione. I'm sure some of you will know it, the famous Tempest. And you can see that Giorgione is taking the sort of the ball of Giovanni Bellini's integration of figures and landscape and really running with it. He's creating something new. There's a very powerful mood in the painting, but it's a poetic mood. It's not necessarily a spiritual or religious one. It's one which is filled with a sort of a strange foreboding. And this is a very famous and significant painting in, I would say, the Western canon because of the new possibilities for art that it proposes. Giorgione belonged to an extraordinarily sophisticated culture, courtly culture. He was extremely erudite. He was steeped in sort of music, poetry, and the very refined culture of his day. He's often associated with the court of Caterina Cornaro in the city of Asolo to the north of Venice. And so and little is known about him. He's this rather romantic, sort of mysterious figure, Giorgione. So because of his erudition, art historians have spilt endless rivers of ink writing about this painting. What could it possibly mean? We have a man on the left standing, leaning against a staff, a woman feeding a baby who looks out at sort of with this rather enigmatic expression. The whole scene is illuminated by a flash of lightning. So as I say, there's a sort of a strange air of mystery and foreboding to this painting. And we sort of, it's easy to forget that just about every painting that's made in this time, every figure, every object has a meaning. You read them like a book. And if you can sort of decipher all the symbols, you get what they're telling you. In the case of Giorgione, nobody's really been able to figure that out. And what I think we need to consider is the extremely radical idea that actually there is no meaning that you're meant to get, which doesn't seem so strange to us now, but for the time, this was an extraordinary thing. The idea that a painting is just a sort of a poetic image which invites the viewer to participate imaginatively in its symbolism, in its imagery, in its mood. And so these paintings are often referred to as poesia or poems. So Titian and Giorgione worked very closely together, and it's, again, art historians are always squabbling about who painted which picture, and it sort of doesn't matter in a way. They both sort of fed off each other, influenced each other, and both produced extraordinary pictures in this very dreamy and poetic vein in the early 1500s. In 1516, Giovanni Bellini died after a very long and productive life, and produced an endless series of different painting styles. Giorgione had died a couple of years before, tragically in the plague. And so Titian, the most famous of all the Venetian artists, was sort of had upon his shoulders sort of the mantle of the leading painter in Venice. And he sort of, in this moment, 1516, he seems to burst out of his shell, and he produces, again, one of the most extraordinary images in the history of Venetian painting, the so-called Assumption of the Virgin. A huge picture, it's several meters high, and it's presents itself to us as an image of sort of blazing warmth and energy. It shows the Virgin Mary after her death being assumed, as we say, into heaven by a host of angels and little putti, and looked at in amazement by the group of apostles who have gathered there to witness this miraculous event. The painting presents an extraordinary sort of breadth of movement and form, and great energy, but it's all very highly structured. If you look at the upper part of the picture, it's based around a circle. The head of the Virgin Mary is in the very center of the circle, and the Virgin Mary connected with the two figures below forms a kind of a triangle. So we have a circle, a triangle, a square, which defines the lower part of the picture. So he's a very thoughtful, very classical sort of a painter. And with the production of works like the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, we see the real arrival of the high Renaissance style, comparable to Michelangelo and Raphael and others, in comparable things that they're doing in the center of Italy, in northern Italy, in Venice. And it's one of the most influential paintings also in the history of art. But I think it's interesting to look at it as well in terms of this theme that I want to develop of the way in which paintings are integrated into their architectural setting. As we walk into the Frari, the great Gothic Franciscan church in Venice, we see at the end of the nave this sort of vision, this warm, splendid vision of gold and red. It's sort of golden background, again, reflecting the tradition of golden mosaics in apses in the painting. And we see it framed by a series of arches, first of the choir, then of the frame at the rear of the church. And as we approach it, we see the very interesting connection, I think, that Titian has made between the light emanating from the painting, this extraordinary warmth, with the light coming through the Gothic windows of the apse behind. So you can see it's a painting on a colossal scale, painted on timber, and again, it looks like a lot of perhaps rather conventional religious paintings that we might see in Italian churches today. But in its time, it was hugely influential and even caused some consternation with the friars who commissioned it, and they were initially a little bit sort of unsure about whether they wanted to have it, such a modern-looking painting on the high altar of their church. But eventually, they came to love it, and there it sits where it was painted some 500 or so years ago. So you can see that we've come through a great progression, just to sort of recap, from the idea of the Sacra Conversazione, which develops with Mantegna, and the harmonious sort of treatment of light and space and atmosphere and mood of Bellini, which creates this extraordinarily unified space. I don't know if you can see the image on the far right, which is the so-called Pesaro Madonna, also in the Church of the Frari, which pushes the Madonna off center and creates a new kind of dynamic, painted just a little bit after the Assumption picture. So it is, the Frari is one of the great churches to see, and very important, I think, certainly in Venetian painting, to see, to experience these paintings in the places for which they were painted, and to understand the ways in which the artists have very cleverly integrated painted architecture with real architecture, and the space inside the building with the spaces inside the painting. Titian went on to become sort of one of the great sort of international superstars of art, and this was largely through the fame of his portraiture. And this, I think, is one of his greatest portraits. This is Pope Paul III, a member of the powerful Farnese family, enormously important figure in the whole history of the Counter-Reformation, this sort of fight back of the Catholic Church against the Protestant Reformation. And but what a wonderful characterization. I mean, not only is the surfaces are so beautifully painted, and again, this is very much a Venetian characteristic, this love of rich, beautiful surfaces, the velvet, but the sitter himself is so powerfully characterized, right down to the hand which caresses the purse, the Pope, this powerful and wealthy man, the head of Christendom. And look at what a wonderful head he has. You can see he's slightly bent with age. He's quite an elderly man, but his intelligence, his cunning, his political nous completely undimmed. What a formidable character he must have been. So Titian becomes the painter of popes, of emperors, of kings. There's a wonderful story of, again, a rather picturesque anecdote. Who knows whether or not it's true, but I think illustrates the esteem in which Titian was held during his lifetime. He's painting the most powerful man in his part of the world of the day, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And as he's painting Charles V's portrait, Titian accidentally drops his brush, in his sort of frenzy of painting. And just as he's about to bend down to pick it up, Charles, the emperor, bends down, picks it up and hands it to Titian himself. So a sort of a homage power is paying to artistic genius. And Titian goes on to have, he's given titles, he becomes very wealthy and lives in a very luxurious studio to the north of Venice, and becomes he's one of the great sort of painters of European art history. Titian, for the Pope's nephew, paints this wonderful nude, the Danae. It's a mythological subject. The beautiful Danae is visited by Zeus, who's the most important god, in the form of a shower of gold. But and there's all sorts of erudite symbolism, no doubt, contained within the painting. But for Titian, it's just a wonderful excuse to paint a ravishing nude. And Titian painted some of the most famous and beautiful nudes, female nudes of art history. He paints it in Rome, and when he's in Rome, Michelangelo goes to visit his studio and is later reported to have said, these Venetians, I mean, Titian, what a wonderful painter he is, but what a pity he, like all the Venetians, didn't learn to draw. Well, we might think it looks very well drawn, but what Michelangelo is saying is that the painting is not based on this very powerful sense of precise contours, of hatching to build up three-dimensional sculptural forms. So here's Michelangelo's Knight on the right-hand side, a hugely important sculpture in its time. It's really one of the touchstones of the Mannerist style. So these rather contorted poses that we find in Mannerism. And we can compare again another Michelangelo drawing, beautiful drawings of arms, which were studies for the picture of Knight in the Medici Chapel in Florence. And again, they're all about precise contours, an understanding of the deeper structure of the arm, the anatomy, how the bones and the muscles all fit together. And Titian's not the slightest bit interested in that. Yes, he wants to make it all look correct, and the contours, yes, are precise. But what interests Titian as a Venetian is the textures, the substance of the flesh, the softness of the flesh, the way the light plays over it, the sensuality of the figure. And perhaps he's even having a bit of a dig at Michelangelo. If you want to represent a woman, this is what a woman looks like, not like your sculptures, which, as you saw from that drawing before, are really more based on male anatomy. So in this opposition between the coloristic effects of the Venetians and Titian in particular, and this very strong emphasis in drawing in sculptures and drawings by Michelangelo, we see a real dichotomy in Italian art. And it's a very famous distinction that between the Venetian so-called colorito, coloring, and the Central Italian or Roman disegno. Disegno meaning both drawing and invention. Disegno contains the idea of improving on nature. And this is really a theme that runs through all of Western art history, I would say. There's the so-called battle of the Poussinists and the Rubenists in 17th century France, and most famously, I suppose, the neoclassical painters like Ingres in early 19th century France, and the Romantics who uphold the importance of colour, like Eugène Delacroix. So it's one of those sort of dichotomies, one of those sort of rivalries that sort of never really gets resolved in art in a way, much to art's benefit, I would say. And you might say, why not have both? Why not have accurate drawing and careful forms and beautiful color? Here's another example again of Bronzino, this very severe sculptural approach of the Florentine artists on the right and the Titian on the left. And Titian had a pupil called Tintoretto. I'm sure you've heard of Tintoretto. Tintoretto and Titian quarreled. They didn't get on very well, it's said. And Tintoretto went off to sort of establish his own studio. Why that was, we don't know. Perhaps Titian felt intimidated by his brilliant young pupil. He was a bit worried about this clever young artist who was going to sort of take away his clients or become more famous than him. And here's a drawing by Tintoretto, again drawn from Michelangelo's Medici tombs. And Tintoretto famously placed a sign in his studio which said, "The drawing of Michelangelo and the colour of Titian." So it was his stated aim to reconcile these two opposing ways of making art, of seeing and understanding the world, and of creating paintings. And so Tintoretto, of course, goes on to be one of the real greats of Venetian art. Here's an interesting example of one of Tintoretto's drawings on the left-hand side, and the painting that he makes for it on the right-hand side. And I'm fascinated. I mean, as an artist, I'm fascinated by the working techniques of other artists. And Tintoretto was said to have created little clay sculptures of the figures that he wanted to put in his paintings, and to have placed them in a little kind of theatre-like box, dimmed the lights and illuminated this little kind of puppet theatre almost that he created, so that he could observe the fall of light and shadow on these figures and use this pattern of light and shadow to create his composition. So that's what he's doing there on the left. And we can see the finished product on the right. It's fascinating to see how he's changed from his original vision. But I think to modernize, in some ways, the left-hand version is more appealing. There's a real sense of the movement of the hand, of the sort of the white-hot energy of creation that's going into the left-hand sketch, whereas the right-hand one is rather more finished. But it's a rather amusing image. I think Tintoretto is an artist with a great sense of humour, a little bit of low comedy here. This is the god Vulcan, who's returning home to find his beautiful young wife, and Vulcan's shown as let's say a more mature man. He's sort of bent over and has a white beard, and he's lifting up the sort of drapery from his the goddess of love, Venus, his wife, and he doesn't realize that on the right hand side of the painting we can just see poking out the head of Mars, who's been visiting his wife, shall we say. And it's one of these sort of devices of comedy that's timeless, isn't it? There's the wife's lover hiding in the cupboard or under the chair or whatever. And in this particular case, we can see Mars, who's trying to keep the little dog quiet. Please don't bark. Don't tell him I'm here. So Tintoretto is an artist with a great range. He painted the the Scuola di San Rocco, one of these charitable confraternities who were great patrons of art, and this is sometimes called the Sistine Chapel of Venice. The walls, the ceilings, and many rooms are decorated with this extraordinary series of paintings by Tintoretto. And the greatest of these, I think, is his famous Crucifixion. Here we can see Tintoretto's extraordinary ability to arrange his figures, a huge number of figures, in a coherent way in his composition. So at the center, we have the crucified Christ, who sort of presides, as it were, over the whole scene. And I particularly like the way that he uses this tremendous energy and a sense of movement to bring a meaning to his painting. So just to the right of Christ, significantly on Christ's left-hand side, this is the sort of the inferior side, we can see the bad thief who's being attached to the cross, and we sense a sort of a downward movement as his tormentors, his executioners, press him downwards. And on the right-hand side, this incredible device of the good thief, that's on Christ's right, the one who will be saved, who's being hauled up. And so a sense of upward movement suggests the principle of salvation. And I like to think that Tintoretto has taken this wonderful figure on the left-hand side who's pulling the rope from something he might have seen in one of the ships of Venice as he hauls on a sheet and raises a sail or a mast. So this is, to me, one of the real masterpieces of Venice. It's an extraordinary painting full of with a really sort of epic scope to it. It's as I say, the organization of the composition, the sense of energy and movement, and the sincere religious feeling is extraordinarily well handled. Tintoretto is, and I don't know if he and Veronese were having a competition to see who could paint the largest picture in Venice, the largest painting in Venice, but I think Tintoretto may have been the winner of this one. If we look at the hall of the Gran Consiglio, the great council hall in the Doge's Palace in Venice, we can see on the far wall Tintoretto's famous Paradiso, the paradise. It's basically a representation of heaven. And in front of this representation, there would have been sitting the grand councillors of the state of Venice. And you get the sense that the juxtaposition of these powerful men and this extraordinarily grand vision of heaven behind them was both a way of proclaiming the divine mandate to rule of the Venetian state on the one hand, and perhaps from the point of view of the senators and the high state officials, the importance of making ethical and just judgments and decisions, lest they too be judged by the great court of heaven. And it's extraordinary image of literally hundreds of figures of the Paradiso. And I think this space is a nice reminder too of the importance of shipbuilding technology to the art of Venice. So the Venetians were the first to paint in oil on canvas, and these are the standard materials of making art today. Oil painting on canvas. This is the sort of the default art materials that are used, and this all came from Venice in the 16th century. And you can see why they decided to use canvas. I mean, given the choice of being like Michelangelo and lying on your back and painting that ceiling, and stretching a canvas over a piece of timber, a timber frame in your studio, and painting an upright picture, I know what I'd choose. I'd choose the nice experience of painting my picture in my studio and later having the painting installed in the ceiling. So all of these paintings are made on canvas. And of course, the other piece of shipbuilding technology that's used in this space is the keel-shaped trusses in the roof. So the Venetians used shipbuilding techniques to span extraordinary spaces. I mean, this is one of the largest rooms, I believe, that's unsupported by columns in Europe. And it's all done by the construction of these trusses, which are made according to a form which is very similar to ships. And Venice had one of the great shipbuilding factories of the world in the Arsenale. So we need to sort of see it in that context. Now, back to Titian. And Titian, like his teacher, Giovanni Bellini, went through a number of phases. He went, as we've seen, through a sort of a Mannerist phase. And he lived, like Giovanni Bellini, to a great age. We don't really know how long he lived, but it could well be that he lived even into his 90s, which is a great age to live in any era, but certainly in those days he would have been so fortunate to have an extremely long and productive life. And he painted this Pietà, a bit like Michelangelo's Pietà, the dead Christ supported by the Virgin Mary, for his own tomb. So it's his own funerary monument as he reached the end of his life. And we can, if you look carefully, if you see the original, when you go to the original in the Accademia, you will see a little kind of ex voto image on the far right-hand side showing a similar sort of view of Titian beseeching or praying to the Madonna in a smaller image. So he sort of repeats that prayer, as it were, in another part of the painting. But we see on the left-hand side Mary Magdalene, who's the patron saint of penitence, so underlining the idea that he's wanting to sincerely repent of all his sins towards the end of his life. And like a little bit like these paintings, the sculptures of Michelangelo towards the end of his life, he supports himself, the dead Christ. So Titian shows a sort of an idealized version of himself, perhaps in the guise of Saint Jerome on the right-hand side. And I like the way that he's shown the niche at the back of the little apse, which is the backdrop for the scene, reminding us that Titian began his professional life as a mosaic artist. So again, this connection between the idea of small tiles of coloured glass or stone making up the mosaic, and the parallel between that and the small touches of paint, small brush strokes by which a Venetian style of painting is created. But if you look closely at this painting, it's not a terribly good image. I could have got a better one, but again, you really need to see these things firsthand. And Titian is really, he's 400 or 500 years ahead of his time with this very sort of loose, this very expressive painting in these somber colours. And he's really taking the oil painting technique to places that it hadn't been before. And with it, he uses the brush strokes in this very powerfully expressive way, and the somber palette create a very intense atmosphere of melancholy and even tragedy. And so paintings like these are really unique in the history of art. They are an example of somebody who is working at the height of his powers for the entirety of his life and going through all sorts of transformations, and towards the end of his life painting in a style a little bit like a late Turner, which I think his contemporaries found confusing. They weren't sure, is he losing his mind? Is his eyesight going? But I think today, with our understanding of modern painting and Impressionism, we can appreciate the extraordinarily expressive handling in these late Titians. And in fact, they're sometimes called, these later paintings are sometimes called magical Impressionism, because they give this, that the loose brushstroke gives this sense of the flickering candlelight and the as I say, the somber mood. So Titian dies in about, I think, 1575. And here we see a lovely representation of the three greats of Venetian art. We've got Veronese on the left, Titian on the right, and I believe that's Tintoretto. Some people say it's Bassano in the centre. And all joined together, playing harmoniously in a kind of chamber orchestra, which I think is a rather nice representation of them. This is a detail from a painting by Veronese, of course. So that's Veronese's self-portrait on the left-hand side. Veronese, as his name suggests, comes from the city of Verona. Titian came from Cadore, which was in the mountains to the north of Venice, and Tintoretto was a native Venetian. And between them, these three really sorted out their market quite cleverly. So Titian was as I said, the international art superstar. He painted popes and kings and emperors and the nobility of Italy. Veronese painted the local nobility of the Veneto and of Venice. And Tintoretto tended to be the painter of the confraternities, the middle classes, and presented himself very much as a man of the people living in a rather rough working class district of Venice. In fact, his Tintoretto studio still exists today, and they have nice art workshops there. And it's in a very interesting part of Venice called Cannaregio, which you really feel is still connected even in today's era of mass tourism. you still feel it's connected to sort of local traditions and local life. And this detail is, of course, from a famous painting of the marriage at Cana, which is when they turned the water into wine. You can see on the bottom right-hand side there, the wine being poured into a jug. And this is Veronese's vision of the world. Life is a celebration, it's a feast, it's splendid, it's magnificent. And there's a rather, I think, poignant, to me anyway, juxtaposition of Christ, who is looking rather sort of remote and isolated, the very center of the composition, and all the sort of worldly magnificence sort of swirling around him. And so it might not seem like a particularly sort of devout religious painting. We certainly don't see that sort of atmosphere of meditation, of contemplation, of devout sincerity that we see in Giovanni Bellini. But, you know, as I say, that the juxtaposition is, I think, rather fascinating. Veronese, of course, got into trouble for this kind of painting, and for one of the paintings that are similar to this, a similar feasting scene, he got hauled up by the Inquisition, and that's a painting that you can see in the Academia. This painting's, of course, in the Louvre. I think it's one of the largest paintings in the Louvre, in fact. And it's a painting that people tend not to notice because it's in the same room as the Mona Lisa. So people just walk straight past this and go and look, have their selfie with the Mona Lisa. But this is really a most extraordinary picture, but for its scale, if for no other reason. And again, I think it's important to remember the architectural context of these paintings. Now, this painting originally hung in the refectory, appropriately enough, for a feasting picture of the monastery on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore. And so it's in a building designed by the great architect Palladio, and it was the original was taken by Napoleon. That's why it's still in the Louvre today. And it's probably never been given back, partly because it would be too difficult to transport such a huge painting. But intriguingly, they've had the ingenious idea, I think, of creating a replica of the painting. This is just something they've done in the last couple of years, and placed it in the refectory itself. So we can get a really nice idea of how the painting related to the space around it, and how and the sort of the meaning it would have had for the monks, perhaps as a kind of a foretaste of paradise, this sort of heavenly feast that's going on the wall in front of them. And I think it's rather nice too to be able to experience the very distinctly Palladian style architecture that Veronese paints as the magnificent backdrop to this picture in a church designed by Palladio himself. But perhaps the greatest collaboration between architect Palladio and painter Veronese is at the Villa Mazere, which is just north of Venice, not far from Treviso. So it's one of Palladio's most magnificent villas. The Venetians in the 16th century, the Venetian nobility sort of reinvented themselves a little bit, and they became gentlemen farmers for various economic reasons. America becomes more of a focus of the world. Silk route's sort of not what it used to be. And they produced, I think, some of the most beautiful country houses ever built. And this one is particularly lovely because, as I said, we see this collaboration between the architect Palladio and the painter Veronese. And this is in one of the main halls of the building. And you have to look at this image for a little while just to work out what's real and what's painted. So at the bottom there, you have a decorated cornice or moulding. And above that, you've got, at the bottom there, you've got a balustrade, but that's actually a painted balustrade. So we've got this very nice integration, again, of architecture and painting. Above that, we've got representations of the gods of Mount Olympus, and symbolic representations of members of the Barbaro families. The whole thing's a lovely conflation between the sort of the principles which govern the world as represented by the gods, the joys of country life, and the splendors of the great Barbaro family. And there, as we walk into the hall, is the lady of the house, Mrs. Barbaro herself, who greets us from the balustrade as we wander in. And another marvelous piece of trompe-l'oeil painting, the portrait, which looks down at us from the ceiling. The Villa Barbaros is full of these wonderful effects. These people sort of peer out from behind doors. little dogs will be sitting on seats, which are illusionistically painted into the wall. All sorts of marvelous effects can be seen in the Villa Barbaro, this great collaboration between Veronese and Palladio. So we're fast forwarding, just to sort of give you a bit of a postscript to Venetian painting. That's the 16th century, the great century of Venetian painting, when Venetian artists are enormously influential throughout Europe. The technique of oil painting is developed by them and becomes, as I say, the default way of painting. We can't imagine Rembrandt or Velasquez or Rubens without this very important example of the Venetians, in particular Titian. He's the person that everyone looks to in the following century, and so art history is sort of unimaginable without them. We sort of get a kind of an Indian summer of Venetian painting in the 18th century, and Veronese, it is in a way reborn in the person of Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, who's most famous, of course, for these wonderful ceilings, which give a sense of infinite distances and these cool, airy spaces as we look up at them. Venice is becoming rather insular, rather inward-looking in the 18th century. It's not the powerful, influential, and wealthy nation it was a couple of hundred years earlier. It's still a very stable society, but as I say, one which is tending to turn inwards upon itself. Here we see a painting which is a kind of an allegory, an apotheosis of the Pisani family in another one of these great villas of the Veneto. This is a much later one, an 18th century villa. And in the center of this image, we can see the youngest son of the Pisani family seated on the lap of a figure representing Venice. So this very strong connection between the Venetian state and the families who govern it, basically, and who expect to govern it for many centuries to come. And around these representations of the Pisani family, you can see other allegorical figures, which are reminding us of the splendor, the importance, the nobility of this important family, all swept up in this wonderfully suave painting by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo. I've read something just before. Painted in 1761. He was 64 when he made it, so hardly a young man. It took him 76 days. So what an extraordinary energy Giovanni Battista Tiepolo had. And so there are examples of Tiepolo's paintings in the churches and the palaces of Venice, which can be seen. He painted many square meters in this fresco style. So the cool palette of Veronese is sort of revived in the 18th century. And I think if you want an interesting parallel could be this very suave energy of Tiepolo with the music of Vivaldi. And Canaletto and Guardia, of course, the two great view painters. They painted what are called vedute, or views of Venice, largely for the tourist market. And they present themselves to us, I think, as a complementary pair. So Canaletto paints Venice of grand traditions, of magnificent ceremony, of this wonderfully stately architecture as a backdrop to everything. That's how I see Canaletto. He's celebrating these centuries-old traditions which have been the sort of the lifeblood of the magnificent state of Venice since the early Middle Ages. And who could have foreseen that Venice could fall so suddenly when Napoleon invaded it at the end of the 18th century? And it literally did go with a whimper rather than with a bang. The Doge took off his ornamental cap and handed it to his aide when the French arrived at his door, and simply said to his assistant, "Here, you can take this. I don't think I'll be needing it anymore." And so Venice then later, after this period, entered, I suppose, a period of decline, creating, I suppose, the romantic tourist Venice that we see today, and something of a sort of a prescient understanding of the decline of Venice. I think we can see in the work of Francesco Guardi, who presents himself as, I think, a complement to Canaletto. So whereas Canaletto shows us the solid Venice of bricks and mortar and grand ceremony, Francesco Guardi in the 18th century shows us Venice as a place of flux, indeed of decay. The light shifts across the lagoon, creating different reflections, and he depicts this brilliantly with this sort of flickering, nervous brushstrokes. The walls, even as we look at them, are crumbling away. The clouds pass, and I think we get a real sense in a larger idea of Venice itself as a glorious idea, which is slowly fading away. That's reading it perhaps with a little bit of romantic hindsight, but I think certainly that we see this sort of contrast between the two painters who were contemporaries of each other. And so going back to the Canaletto, I want to mention the Bucintoro. It's extraordinary state barge that the Venetians built out of gilded and carved wood. That's that golden boat you can see on the right-hand side there with the red flag just in front of the ducal palace. And what an amazing thing it must have been. Where is it now, you might say? Well, when Napoleon took over Venice, he publicly had it burnt to symbolically proclaim that he was in charge now, and that all the what he would have seen as rather tawdry splendor of the great Venetian Republic was now no longer, and a new era was coming into being, as indeed it was. And so from the time of the sort of Napoleonic invasion, Venice sort of, I said, fell into decline, and then soon after became part of the newly unified Italy. So the whole idea of a sort of a uniquely Venetian culture, I think it still exists, but not in the same degree of splendor and a powerful sense of identity that it had in the earlier centuries. So that's a little bit of an overview. I hope I haven't gone on for too long to the some of the wonderful artists that you can see when you visit Venice, and I hope some of you will be able to visit with me in future tours. So thank you all for your attention, and thank you very much, Kristen and Susannah, for hosting me and giving me the opportunity, as I said, to indulge my enjoyment of all these lovely paintings and extraordinary personalities. And so please let me, I'd be happy to answer any question if anyone has got any, such as I may be able to.
Well, thank you so much, David. That was really fabulous. I think all of us learned an enormous amount from listening to your talk. I must say I'm disappointed you don't want to do that Michelangelo thing and climb up ladders and lie on your back on a platform and paint a ceiling above you with paint dripping in your eyes.
Not
but
me, no.
It was a really fantastic talk. Thank you so much. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask you, please feel free to go ahead and ask David questions. David, have you got a favourite spot in which to paint in Venice?
I do have a few favourite spots, I suppose, but what would they be? I suppose that the places I've been painting in recently, I love the spaces under the porticos in St. Mark's and views of all that elaborate architecture seen from these sort of dim, shadowy spaces, and you look out to these luminous buildings, and I really enjoyed playing with the contrast between sort of interior and exterior spaces. But whenever I paint in Venice, I always remember talking to an acquaintance of mine who's a very distinguished Venetian landscape artist, and I remember remarking at a painting he'd done, so, oh, that's a great view. I don't know that one. I must go and see that. And he said, yes, that is, you probably haven't seen that. He said, but you must never think that as an artist you've discovered this hitherto never before painted view of Venice. He said, because Venice has been painted by so many artists over so many years that no matter how secret and special you think it is, it's probably been done before. But that's okay. I mean, it's never been painted by me before. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
And anyone wanting to check out David's paintings, do look at his website. And of course, some of his art is for sale through his website. And I know that David holds exhibitions regularly in various Australian cities. So keep us posted as to what's coming up, David.
Yeah, no.
Just going back to very early in the talk, Elizabeth was curious about what were they painting with before oils? Pigments, yes, or yes, the frescoes, and what pigments did they use?
Well, yes, I should have elaborated on that, but usually the technique was egg tempera, which is basically egg yolk with pigments mixed together, maybe a little bit of oil, which you'd think would be, the cockroaches that eat it or something. But apparently it's incredibly stable. It's a better medium than oil painting. But that's a very good question. And the advantages of egg tempera is that it's very stable. The color doesn't fade or change with that particular vehicle, the egg yolk. But the problem is that it dries quite quickly, and the only way you can really paint it is with little kind of hatching strokes. And so it doesn't have any of that versatility of the oil medium. It's very opaque. You can't quite get the detail, and you certainly can't build up all those lovely atmospheric layers of paint that you can with oil painting. But if you look at any sort of altarpiece of the Middle Ages, of sort of the 14th up to the mid 15th century, it's almost certainly going to be in egg tempera. And it's wonderfully brilliant color, but it's a different sort of painting to oil painting. Yeah. They had a sort of transitional period too, where they painted in this sort of combination of egg tempera medium and oils. I'm not quite sure how it all worked, but it's been described as something a bit like mayonnaise, if you can imagine egg and oil mixed together. But and that was something that Antonello used quite a lot. So yes, I think the techniques and the history of oil of painting from a technical point of view is a fascinating one. Yeah.
I do have another question here from Karen, who is curious about the abundance of gold and vibrant pigments in Venetian painting. Was it due to its position on international trade routes, do you think?
Yes, that's a very important point. Yes, I mean, Venice was at the sort of the western end of the Silk Road. So that sort of taste for luxury, for opulence, for refinement is very much a part of the fact that they would have been trading in precious fabrics, in rare pigments and rare dyes. And in fact, the name Tintoretto means the little dyer. So he came from a family of dyers. So there are all these industries that were connected with all of the materials and the rare and precious and exotic sort of goods that came along the Silk Road from, I suppose, as far away as China. Yeah, so that's very much a hallmark, I think, of Venetian painting. Yeah, absolutely.
Sue just asked, did I understand that you said that the ceiling paintings of Venice were painted on canvas and then lifted into position?
That's correct. Yeah, that's my understanding, that they had the canvas stretched over a wooden frame, just as a modern day artist uses, and so they can work on that, either leaning against a wall or up in their on an easel in their studio, and then they can the painting can either be moved with its frame, just simply put on a boat depending on its size, or it can be demounted from its frame and the canvas just rolled up. You can roll, if the paint is dry, you can roll the canvas up, and you can transport it that way, and either transport your frame with it or have another frame made. So it meant that paintings became incredibly portable. The other reason why they painted in oils on canvas was because they couldn't really paint in fresco in Venice. And we saw some fresco paintings by Tiepolo. There are some 18th century fresco paintings in Venice, but in the earlier period, they hadn't really worked out, particularly when they're painting in outdoor settings, how to prevent salt from getting into the plaster walls, and the frescoes very quickly got ruined in the damp air and the damp salty air. So oil painting was something that worked much better than fresco painting in Venice. And if you're painting large areas like that, the canvas, a primed canvas, is the best way to go. It also meant, of course, working on canvas, that painters like Titian could make a painting in his studio, roll it up, put it on a boat and put it on whatever, and it could go to anywhere in Europe, basically, because they were so transportable. So all those paintings we see, I believe, in the Doge's Palace are on canvas, and it's the sort of the roll call of the great Venetian artists. There are paintings by Tintoretto, Veronese. I can't think that if there are any there might be a couple by Titian, but they're all dating to the later. Sadly, the Doge's Palace was gutted by fire in, I think, about 1577, and you're horrified to think of the Bellinis and the Titians and great masterpieces that all went up in smoke. But fortunately, they were still in an age when they could make magnificent things. So we see the later 16th century decoration and paintings is really part of one of the great glories of the Doge's Palace in Venice.
Just the last one I've got in here to round it up is probably a good one from Jennifer. She says, if one only has a couple of days in Venice, what are your top picks for seeing some of these great works of art?
Yeah, I would say my top picks would be, but if we're purely talking about painting, well, the Doge's Palace, which I said contains works by Tintoretto and Veronese and many others. Probably the Accademia, I suppose, is the top place. That's where the Pietà, the great Veronese feast picture, and many other paintings, beautiful paintings by Bellini. I suppose the Accademia is the best place in the world to see Venetian painting. That's the Accademia Museum. The Frari is very important. The Church of the Frari, where the two great Titians, and they've also got a beautiful Bellini there. So they'd be my sort of top three picks. But I'm just trying to think. There are all sorts of a good thing to do, and you can do it fairly quickly, is to get a list of the paintings. And again, if you're on an art trail, in the churches of Venice, and there'll be a little church sort of at some quiet corner of Venice, and you walk in, and there'll be no one in the church, and you walk down there, and it'll read your guidebook, and there will be a wonderful Bellini or something like that. And I think that's a great way of sort of discovering art in Venice. I can't off the top of my head give you a top pick of all the lists. San Giovanni e Paolo is a great one. San Zaccaria, where that Bellini, which I think is the greatest Bellini of all, that altarpiece that I showed you. It's an incredibly rich place. And then if you want something completely different, I suppose you can go to the Guggenheim Museum and see all the paintings made by Peggy Guggenheim's lovers, which is although there's an interesting side to go on this. Somebody said, Peggy Guggenheim said that she would trade all of her Jackson Pollocks and Max Ernsts for a single Bellini, she said, which I thought was rather interesting. Yeah. So,
she wasn't talking about the cocktail.
She wasn't talking about the cocktail. No, that's right, yeah. About the painting, I presume, yeah.
Well, I think the best way to see Venice is with a guide called David Henderson, because that way you really get to study the wonderful art and the treasures of that city with somebody who knows it incredibly well, speaks Italian, and as David has illustrated this evening, is just so incredibly knowledgeable about the history of art. So David, an enormous thank you from me and from everyone at ASA, and I'm sure I'm speaking for all of our audience here tonight. It's been a really fabulous start to our Travel Tuesdays. Our next event is on Tuesday, the 28th of March, and I'm going to be talking about highlights of literary northern France. So I'll take you to the land of Proust and Flaubert, of Georges Sand and Rimbaud, of Verlaine, and so many other wonderful French writers. So I do hope that you will join me. Of course, ASA will be sending you the link in plenty of time, and a reminder a day or so before the event takes place. We would love to have you join us for future Travel Tuesdays. We've lined up a wonderful range of speakers, and I know you're going to enjoy traveling to many fascinating countries throughout the course of this lecture series throughout the year. So thank you all very much for being here for the very first one. We'll keep you posted as to what's coming up. A huge thank you to David from all of us, and I know Kristen will join me in saying thanks to David. He really has given us an absolute treat this evening. So thanks everyone. Bye-bye. See you again.
Thank you so much, David.
Bye.
That was fabulous, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. No, it's my great pleasure. I hope.
Thanks everyone, and we will see you in a month's time. Bye.
Thanks very much,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.